Welcome, everybody. Very, very excited to have you all here. We have a special guest with us, an emotional intelligence sensei. So we are coming together under the Life Shift Summit and, shifting out of crisis into crushing it in your life. And so this is for anyone in quarter life, midlife, or what I'm terming COVID life crisis, which really is just an opportunity. Any crisis is really just an opportunity to expand and become greater and do more in the world, really. So the word crisis literally comes from the Latin root, which means to decide, to decide. So anytime we're in a crisis, we're just ready to make a new decision, create a new way. We're sort of like been through this school of life, everything that's happened in our lives up till this moment of the crisis has been good and right, nothing bad or wrong. We're just ready to expand beyond that. It's sort of a graduation, right? Ready to graduate and move forward. But if we get caught up in crisis mindset, which is very fear-based, we tend to collapse and get stuck. So our only goal with this summit is to help people uncollapse, expand, and move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about Antesa. Antesa is an emotional intelligence expert. She's a personal transformation coach, or at least that's what I would call her, keynote speaker, an EQ workshop facilitator, which I hope to learn more about today. Antesa also facilitates expedition-style intensives through her company, Adventure Awake, and has a really brilliant TED Talk online called The Body's Language and Its Undeniable Impact. Antesa is a masterful at getting straight to the heart of things, unlocking hidden potential, and understanding the language of your emotions, which in my opinion is key in the pursuit of happiness, understanding your passion and your purpose in life. So with all that said, welcome, Antesa. Did I get to all of it? Is there more you'd like to say about yourself?
Wow, you really covered all of it. I guess it might be worthwhile, since I think most of your audience is probably in the US. I'm American, but I am based in Copenhagen, and I have been expatriated here for 9 years, a little over 9 years. And one of the things I often say is that I should give credit to my expertise in emotional intelligence to having been an expat, because when I moved to Denmark, my American way of going about creating connection and building depth in my relationships didn't work here in the same way that it did in the United States. And I had to learn that there were other ways of relating that didn't follow the same social cues that I had been conditioned to stand by. And so I often say, tak for det, Denmark, which means thanks for that, Denmark, because it was a struggle when I first got here, and it actually ended up birthing what is now my purpose in my life. Wow. And where I do a lot of my work.
Can you give us an example, like what a difference between how they do it in Denmark and how we do it here?
Yeah, I like to use the metaphor that Americans are like peaches and Danes are like coconuts. And so Danes are sort of world renowned for not being terribly open. They're not very easy to read. And they're not typically quite very emotionally expressive either, neither in their language. They actually don't have as many words. They have 1/6 the number of words that English has.
Wow.
So they're limited in the amount of language that they have to express themselves, but they've also been socially discouraged to err on the sort of intangible aspects of life. And there's a lot more emphasis on knowledge and facts and proof and evidence and just, scientific mindset. And Americans, in their way of being like peaches, are pretty open on the surface. They're usually quite outgoing. We're trained to be outgoing. We're trained to perform. And it's often more difficult to get to the core of an American. That you get to a certain depth of an American, and then you require a little bit of mastery to break into that inner nugget that you see in a peach. And I would say that that's probably the biggest example. Is you could listen to a Dane talk, but you don't necessarily feel anything being transmitted off of them. They're not terribly transparent. Mm-hmm. And so I felt that I needed to develop skill set in order to create transparency in the people I was with, because I could feel that there was some lack in substance in the connections that I was making, and I didn't know how to access it or guide the connection in a way that facilitated that. And that was actually where I ended up getting my training, is understanding that disparity, which I naturally was inclined toward. I knew it was dissonant. I knew there was something that was out of integrity, but I had no idea how to move the relationship in a way that made it feel more resonant and integrous. And so that was where my coaching skill came in and saved the day. So.
Yeah, awesome. I have a question then, just real briefly here. So if you were to walk up to a Dane on the street and you wanted to meet somebody, how would you approach them?
You know, it's a loaded question because on the one hand, being outgoing can elicit a certain response from Danes because they are responsive to their environment, but they respond with suspicion. And so if you and your outgoing, you know, tri-state area sort of personality, people will be like, why are you talking to me? You know, like that would be like, what is your intention in that? And there's also this, this culture around protecting someone's privacy and like really preserving it. But if you were to make eye contact and then move slowly, and then like, you know, you kind of have to mirror their social awkwardness a little bit by like getting that verbal cue that it's okay to come closer and then starting a conversation. But I would say that it happens less frequently here than it does in the US, where, you know, just walking up to someone and being like, hi, new friend, like that's a very American mindset. And Danes just would never even think like that. They actually have a distinguishment between someone who's an acquaintance and someone who's a friend. And they would never call someone a friend unless they really meant it. And they take it very seriously and evaluate whether they have the space and the capacity for a friendship, which is a very Danish thing that Americans do not consider. You know, like
so
you're kind of the more the merrier in the United States. And so that guides our, you know, it's so perfect that you asked that question because it kind of guides our thought process. Is like, why wouldn't you want someone to come and introduce yourself to them? And Danes don't think like that at all. It's just not a part of their.
So interesting. Group mindset, right? How a community operates. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, listen. So I'm interested to know about EQ, what that term means. Wow, what is it? And like, if relative to what we're doing here in the Life Shift Summit, how would it apply in shifting or helping people to shift or move out of crisis mindset into crushing it, or, you know, into like experiencing success or achievement in some way?
Such a good question and so relevant for right now. So EQ, it's actually, I mean, emotional intelligence, I guess, is technically EI. EQ is the measurement of your emotional intelligence. And they're used interchangeably. I use EQ. I say I'm an EQ expert. And effectively, it is the intelligence of your emotional capacity. It's the intelligence of your empathy. It's your emotional literacy. So your ability to communicate what you feel. So rather than what you know and how you think, EQ, which is IQ, EQ is how you feel and like what you're feeling and your level of compassion, your level of empathy. And a lot of people might say, okay, great, I'm going to stop there. I totally know what's going on with other people. But one aspect of EQ that often gets missed is it's not just about your ability to read other people, it's also your ability to read and communicate on behalf of yourself. And there's some nuance here that's really relevant as it pertains to the COVID life crisis, as you're calling it, which I love, not to celebrate this time, which is really challenging for a lot of people. But the lower our EQ, the more challenging this time is going to be, inevitably, because what's going on right now is causing our system, our nervous system, a great deal of stress. And depending on how we're impacted on it, you know, like if we're having the luxury problem of just being required to stay home and shelter in place, that has its own set of struggles to the other person who lives hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, who has a different set of struggles, and they're living in two very different realities. And so I don't know who your audience is, and I will try to speak to both of those actually, because it might be that, you know, people are dealing with different things. But one of the things that I really love about emotional intelligence is that it sort of exists outside of cultural difference. Which is really relevant for me as a global citizen. I've lived in 3 different countries. I lived in New York City. I've traveled to almost 50 countries in the world, and it is how I make the connections that I make and how I get the unique experiences that I do, which is behind what I do with Adventure Awake, which are the intensives that I run. And when you're dealing with cultural differences, like for example, someone who's having the luxury problem of needing to stay home and the stress that that entails, which is very real. There's no like better or worse scenario versus someone who's worried about feeding their children. That's actually a more legitimate fear, you know, like it's really hitting at the core fear, which doesn't mean that the other person's experience of fear doesn't exist. It's just a little bit more buried because basically in both cases, our system is in an activated or sympathetic dominant state. And so I think we've talked a little bit about the nervous system in our previous conversation. One of the most valuable aspects of emotional intelligence is knowing when you are dissonant or you're out of alignment, which is to say you're reacting to something versus not reacting.
Right.
And we all have two parts of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. There's a sympathetic nervous system and there's a parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for calming us down, and the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for stirring things up. And they're both necessary for the body to function. You know, one's in charge of the inhale, one's in charge of the exhale, one's in charge of digestion, one's in charge of the functions of eating. And so it's not that you want to be 100% in parasympathetic or 100% in sympathetic, but understanding what your behavior and attitude looks like when you are sympathetic dominant, which by the way, a good majority of people in the Western world are outside of Corona times, helps you understand what you need, what your life needs to look like, what your capacity is.
Okay, so stop 1 second. I just want to slow you down a little bit because
yeah.
I think if I'm having a challenge, other people may be having a challenge with something. When you
Yes.
say sympathetic dominant,
Yes.
so explain to me sympathetic a little more clearly, like what sympathetic and parasympathetic is like. So what does sympathetic dominant actually mean?
So sympathetic dominant means that you're stressed out.
Okay.
That means that your sympathetic nervous system is working in a larger ratio to your parasympathetic nervous system. So there's more of your overall energy. I'm glad you asked this question because you're totally right. This is normal conversation for me every day, but it's not easy to understand. It means that you're more of your energy. We all have a fixed amount of energy available every day, and energy goes towards the way that the body functions. And ultimately, you want the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system to be operating in not necessarily equal amounts, but complementary amounts.
In unison, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They need to support one another. And most people in the Western world, because of the way that we have been trained to live, particularly in the last century or so, are sympathetic dominant, which is to say we're out of balance. We've been putting too much energy towards the things that stress us out and that don't restore us, and too little energy towards the things that help us digest and help us relax.
Okay.
And so when you get into a circumstance like COVID, where regardless of what your life is like, most people have been living in sympathetic dominance before this occurred. Now, because of the uncertainty piled on top of a lifestyle where we believe that our worth lies in our productivity, for example, or the amount of time and output that we put on things, like being busy is a bragging right for a lot of people, for example. Hustling is this thing that is evidence that you are doing well in the world. That's particularly American. And when you live that lifestyle and then you're forced to stand still and you can't do any of that stuff, it starts to hit at your core belief systems. And we have a nervous system response to that, which is a stress response. It's a threat response. It's a sympathetic dominant response. And if you're emotionally intelligent, you also know your subtle cues, not just everyone else's subtle cues. And so let's say I'm having a sympathetic dominant response, I'm reacting to something. I would notice, oh wow, my reactive style is to get avoidant. My reactive style is to, let's see, some of the common ones is to not say anything. My reactive style is to fight back. You know, fight, flight, freeze are the most common ones, but a lot of intellectually advanced people have very subtle, socially acceptable forms of reactivity, like,
Right.
you know, over intellectualization, which is one of mine, by the way,
Right.
is, you know, like you get too heady and you completely leave your body experience totally. When you're having that kind of response, recognizing it and then giving yourself what you need to put your system back into resonance before taking action on something. So you're then become, you know, a lot of people have heard this, become responsive, not reactive. And that's more like a Buddhist approach, is like you get mindfulness, you know, work towards and practice towards mindfulness so that you can be responsive to your environment rather than reactive to it.
Right. Is this what you, when we talked last time, you mentioned the term integral resonance? Is this what you're speaking?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when I talk about integral resonance, so one of the things that I just shared, the nervous system response is one dimension of resonance that is important for us to look at. And that's one dimension. So our nervous system balance is one dimension. Another form of resonance would be, is what I say in alignment with what I do? Am I in integrity, integral? Am I in integrity in that way? Is what I think and what I feel in alignment with what I say? That's another level of integrity. So there's multiple dimensions. I like to look at it as a sphere, because we like to think, okay, I'm going to just do a lot of yin yoga and then I will be in tune and life will be fine. But the reality is our lives are very multidimensional, and our approach to it also needs to be comprehensive, integral, and multidimensional as well. So that's what I mean by integral resonance.
Right. I like the word integrity. I use it a lot in my work, and I always define it for people as it just means being whole and complete, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It means to be whole and complete. So good. So this thing you're speaking about with the COVID life crisis, and that everybody's really going through, it's a worldwide phenomenon, right?
Mm.
Also easily crosses over into our personal crises, like people are midlife or quarter life or any sort of existential crisis, that, you know, if we're in sympathetic, right? The sympathetic response, we're sympathetic dominance, we're caught up in fear. That's how I hear what you're saying. It's like,
that's
and
right.
a lot of times that fear, that stress is fear. It's a word that, by the way, men invented. Men specifically, not women, because we're afraid to say fear, so we came up with stress. And so stress is fear. And so we're, you know, if the fear is in the background and we're not fully owning it, it will cause us to collapse and get stuck. It'll be hard for us to move, because you know, that you said fight, flight, or freeze, right? I think a lot of people get caught up in freeze around, you know, these crises. And then there's this, you talked about being, especially as Americans, we're so invested in being productive and being busy and looking busy. And then when you freeze, you don't look so busy, right? And on top of everything else, we start to then shame and guilt ourselves for not being productive, or for being in the situation to begin with, like, hey, there's something wrong. And really, there is nothing wrong. The crisis is not a wrong thing. It's like a moment where you're just ready to expand, right? And so if you could just take that on, I would assume this would be one way to move out of being sympathetic dominant, is to, you know, step back, take a breath, take a look, and get that this is just an opportunity. Like, I use this in a previous interview, this analogy, I'll probably use it often, but it's like being a butterfly in the cocoon, right? You've grown, right? You've got these full set of wings. You've been through everything you need to have this transformation, but you're still in the cocoon, and you don't get that it's time to come out of the cocoon. It's time to leave that last cycle and enter the new cycle, the new universe, right? So, yeah,
can you complete the metamorphosis?
Yes, the metamorphosis, right? Transformation, shift, change, whatever you want to call it. But we have it like, we're so caught up in not wanting to change, right? Feel safe or not, and like, this thing we've been doing makes us look good or feel good, or it seems to protect us or keep us safe, make a certain amount of money, whatever it is. A lot of fear is involved. And so we don't really get that actually what's coming is much greater if we just give in and flow with it. So that's the work I try to do with my clients, my people, help them just be okay. Like, this is okay. It's good. It's not bad. It's not, you didn't do anything wrong. This is a natural cycle in life for everyone. And what's happening with COVID, I believe, is I've seen this anyway. You may have seen this as well in your work, but in general, this thing we call midlife crisis has actually been happening earlier and earlier. It's coming sooner and sooner because of the pace of our society, how things are, working, how we're expanding. But COVID's actually pushed a lot of people into it almost prematurely, right? Right. So how do we help them with the work that you do, with the emotional intelligence work and this, vibrational work? Like, how do we help them get some control over that? Like, get some charge over shifting their own vibration and maybe, using it as a way to catapult them into the next, phase or stage? It's
so good. I think you and I are really similar, where there's like 10 questions kind of packed in one, and 10 little threads. It's so wonderful. I love it. I'm sure that your clients also love it, and the people who are listening to this will probably be just wanting to listen to it multiple times. What you say is so essential, and I think that what I hear in what you're talking about is, or what I deduce from it is really about the ways in which we attach value to all experience. And so this kind of errs on the this sort of moves into Buddhism, for example, where there's practice of non-judgment. And, I have clients who ask me all the time, Antesa, how do I not sound so judgmental? And, the sort of the guru response to that is, don't judge.
Yeah, right.
But the reality is that we are so wrapped up and strapped into a life where everything has a perceived value to it, which is why we ask ourselves the question of, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Am I doing it the right way or the wrong way? Those questions have a belief system underneath them, which is that I believe that I'm only good under these conditions. I believe I'm only right under these conditions. And to be wrong is bad. To be wrong is life-threatening, for example. And so put in a circumstance where no one has any idea what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, and you can imagine that would be really, really destabilizing for someone who's been living in a reality where right and wrong govern every choice that they've made for their entire lives. And we've been trained this way. We've been biologically wired this way by our parents who believed the same thing. And so of course that's how we think. And so the way I like to talk about it is, if you were never taught any different, that's no one's fault. That's not your parents' fault. It's also not your fault, but you get to learn another way. And one of the most freeing things that we can learn is that there's no such thing as right or wrong. There's only the present moment, really. Like, there's this block universe theory of time that there's literally no future and there's no past. There's only simultaneous present moments stacked on top of each other until the infinite universe. And I just love that, because for me, I really experience it that way. It's like, we have to spend a lot of energy bringing our past experiences in, projecting them onto our present experience to make these decisions and evaluate whether or not something is right or wrong. And if we can go through a practice, and this takes hours of practice, it takes days, years of practice, noticing all the places where we're attaching value to things, and then looking for validation that our attached value is the correct one through our connections. It's a sophisticated form of collusion that we are wrapped up in as humans all the time. It's what we dedicate most of our thoughts to. We have something like 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are evaluative thoughts. The ones that rock us become beliefs, and those are what fuel our actions. Emotion, energy, and motion. That comes from us believing a thought and deciding that it's true and taking action on it. Right. And then, of course, we're going to go find evidence of what we believe, and that's the reality that we're going to experience. And that's Byron Katie's work. She's brilliant. And it's really, really powerful to realize how much of our energy is devoted to this conclusive judgment, and the thing to replace it with, and this is, I really like to talk about these things as, we have this idea, well, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to never do it again because we decide it's wrong. It's wrong to be judgmental. And I like to, because I really like to soften the blow of that, I like to say, what if you repurposed that reactive behavior to something else? Like, if you're a rebellious person reactively, so someone tells you to do something and you're like, I'm going to rebel just because you said I shouldn't do it or whatever. When you start to go into a transformational period in your life where you're really explicitly trying to grow, you might repurpose rebellion to, I'm going to rebel against any typical habitual thought that I have. I'm going to try something different, and I'm going to use my rebellion in a positive way, because you loosen up the rigidity of the response, and then suddenly things become neutral. And the true like spiritual experience is that everything is completely value neutral, including love. And when we are guided by high sensation, we're either in reacting, we're reacting either way, and it's either a negative reaction or a positive reaction. And ultimately, you know, this is what all like Buddha talked about and Gandhi talked about, and you know, it's just Thich Nhat Hanh talked about, is like, how do you get to a place of ultimate neutrality? Because that's where the bliss exists. That's where the wisdom lies. And ultimately that's where discernment comes in. And discernment is judgment that comes from the heart. And there you have so much more wisdom and so much more trust in your process, in the process of everyone, and compassion and empathy. And that's where emotional intelligence will eventually take you if you go into it in that way.
Yeah, that's great. I also do some work with judgment. I'm a Course in Miracles student and teacher, and the Course in Miracles says, don't judge because you can't. Like, from your perspective, from the point where you believe you're at right now, which isn't really the truth, but believing you're this little bag of bones in water in a certain point in space and time, from that place, you can't really judge anything. Are you
Right.
capable from that place of being absolutely circumspect, knowing everything always, everywhere, from every point in space and time? No. So you can't really understand what is true or right. And that the part of our mind, which the Course calls the ego, I call it the micro mind, you were speaking about, we're all sort of born into it, is it's designed to limit. It's designed, it only thinks in binary, right? It thinks in right or wrong, good or bad, more or less, and that's all it's ever doing. You're either, if you're right, I'm wrong, or if you're wrong, I'm right, right? So it's a separation mechanism. It's how we sort of separate things out and keep ourselves from experiencing true connection, right? Constantly. And you know, I like this idea, the distinction between discernment and judgment, right? So it's the same mechanism, but it's a very different outcome, right? So
It's the same mechanism. One's focused on your thought process and one is focused on your heart.
Right. One is placing value.
Yeah, exactly.
One way or another, right? So the other one is just noticing. So discernment is like, okay, this person is walking across the street, or they're standing in a street corner, they have their child's hand, and then the child runs out in the street, and the mom runs out there and spanks the child. Well, you know, judgment would be like, that mom is a terrible mom because she's abusing her child, or that mom is a great mom because she's trying to save her child's life, right? Discernment would be, there's a woman standing at the street corner holding her child's hand. The child just ran out the street and got spanked, period.
Right.
That's like, you can.
There's no evaluation of the experience.
Right. No value, no placing your value on it, right? So it's value neutral, as you would say. And it completely frees you. Like, from that place, you will always, according to the Course of Miracles, you will always make right decisions from that place.
Yes.
Because it's not fear-based, it's not fight or flight, it's just what's appropriate, right? What's the best thing that can be done in this situation, in this moment in time. So, you know, I love that. So if you were to say, thank you for giving me an opportunity to share in that with you, because we definitely are thinking a lot alike. So this idea of, again, just helping people shift out of the crisis mindset, which is a judgment, right? Is because they're judging. We tend to judge things like, you know, if it's a change, it's bad and wrong, right? Or if a change is a coming, it's bad and wrong. We get scared about it. So how do we take charge of it? Like, is there a way to take charge of it and shift our vibration? Like, specifically, one thing I can give these people right now today from you that they could go home with.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say that I think that a lot of people intellectually think that they're very available for change. And so one of the conflicts that people are experiencing right now is they tell themselves, wow, I can English. They tell themselves that they should be okay with this. And that's where the flaw is that sometimes being present means that you're a complete wreck for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a big issue with saying, I don't have the capacity right now. And what a lot of people are learning in this crisis is that even staying at home is actually utilizing a lot of the available resources that we have. And a lot of people who are otherwise guided by being busy are telling themselves, I should be doing something right now. Why am I gaining weight? Why am I so tired? I shouldn't be. I'm doing less now than I was before. And I say, throw that garbage out the window. Because the reality is that no matter where you come from, your response is your response, and it begs to be listened to. And if your response is one of stress, or one of, I need to sleep 11 hours a night, or one of, I can't sleep right now, or one of, I feel afraid, those are legitimate experiences. And what we often do is we go look outside of ourselves to determine how it's okay to show up and what other people are doing. And when we're out in society, it's really easy to pull those cues from the world. But the truth is that the world has been really out of tune for a really long time. And so it's good that we don't have the social cue to stay out of tune. And it's necessary that we go through a calibration period where we're adjusting to listening to ourselves. And if I were to give one piece of advice to anyone, it's to not waste a moment in the pursuit of learning how to listen to and read your own body's subtle communication, which is what my TED Talk is all about. And, we talk a little bit about what it means to feel purposeful. Psychological safety is a really, really essential ingredient in people being able to perform well. And one of the reasons why we don't have psychological safety in a lot of places is because we don't know how to read our own body's cues. We just look for cues outside of ourselves, and then we try to make decisions based on that. And we don't have that opportunity with all the social distancing that's existing at the moment. And so we're all in a crash course learning how to read our own body's cues and to find out what we truly need without anybody to validate our experience for us, except for maybe your immediate family if you're in lockdown or in social distancing or shelter in place with your family.
Right.
If you're alone, you're in more of a vacuum in many ways, it's like an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And this is really how people become enlightened if they use that time well. Use it to go all the way in. And that means like a scientist zooming all the way in the petri dish into the cell until you can see the nuances of that cell. It's the same. Like if you're having a breakdown, have your breakdown. If you're crying, cry. If you need to cry for weeks, cry for weeks. Like your body is letting go of potentially multiple generations of not listening to ourselves. And we need to be gentle. We need to be kind with ourselves in that process. This is not a time for everyone to start up a new business or to transition to being online, which is what a lot of people are doing. It is for some people, but it's not for everyone. And those of us, I say my reality in many ways is very different than a lot of people's because I've lived in a shelter in place world for many years because of the way that I live my life. I like to be alone. I love meditating for multiple hours a day. I write a lot. And so for me, being asked to stay home and to not see people for multiple months at a time isn't really that far out of my wheelhouse. And as a result, I personally feel like I have a responsibility to create in a way that's guiding those who are doing this for the first time, because there was a time where that was hard for me.
Right.
And those who are struggling, all I say to them is you don't have to rush. We have an eternity. And if what you're feeling right, like for me, all goes back to integral resonance. If you're being pulled out of tune, trying to create something too fast,
Yeah.
what you should be listening to is the dissonance. Is that dissonance necessary? If not, let it go.
Got it. That is solid advice. Thank you for bringing it forward. Like, just what I hear you saying, the short version, how I'm hearing is allow or accept the moment. I mean, go into it. Don't try to get away from it, right?
Yes.
Go all the way into it. Allow it to give you whatever is, it's sort of like going into the cocoon, right? Allowing the cocoon the time it needs to grow those wings, right?
Yes.
That's imperative. And some people are there. Everybody's in different phases or stages, right? So,
Yes.
but that will ultimately lead to the breakthrough, right? You have to be in the
Absolutely.
breakdown, and then, you know, that leads to the
That's
breakthrough.
right. One precedes the other. I like to say, because I tend to work with people who are high performers, who are high producers, who are high achievers, and mastery comes in the slow. And
Right.
I had a hard time digesting that at one point in my life too. But it's true. If you can be masterful in the slow, you can be very masterful in the fast. And I'm a fan of moving at quantum speeds. And so for me, it was really necessary to learn how to move slow.
Yeah.
And I like to tell my clients the fastest way forward is inward. And so that usually dismantles what's needed, that to sort of stop that rush and that impatience that we feel, or that idea or value that we put on a specific level or marker point of progress. Because the reality is when you start going inward, your markers for progress are completely different. You can't possibly know what those are until you're already through them. And if you know where you're going, that is evidence that you're not growing. If you have no idea and you don't understand, chances are likely that you're growing. And
I'm writing these down, so I'm not ignoring you. They're really,
but it's an essential thing to understand, because usually the smart people want to do the things that are easy and familiar to us.
right.
And in emotional intelligence, if we've never been taught or modeled what it looks like to go into your emotional experience,
Yeah.
it's the great unknown, huge mystery, and feels terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to have a coach in those times so that you have someone reassuring you that you're not doing something wrong. But it is hard to do it when you're alone. And so, of course, if you have the means, finding a coach is great, but there are tons and tons of free resources out there as well. You know, there's nonviolent communication, there's recovery work, all of that designed to help you become more aware of your process so that you have enough sense of security to let go and surrender.
Awesome. Yeah. We're running out of time here, so I want to thank you so much. I think that's beautiful. I'm going to end with reiterating what you said. Mastery is in the slow. I love that. Never heard that before. Very good. And the fastest way forward is inward. And the other thing you said is if you know where you're going, you're likely not growing, or something to that effect, right?
Yeah, I love it. It's rhymes. I should put that on my website.
Yeah, you see those. All three of those are powerful. I extracted them out for you. So thank you so much. You're brilliant. I think you're really good at what you do, and I'm sure your clients really benefit from your support. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
I would definitely like to do this again with you.
Yes, absolutely. If you do another summit, let's talk.
Okay, awesome.
Sure.
All right. That's a break, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.